Okay, so that brings us to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis gives energy for almost all life on Earth because, again, the sun is the ultimate energy source. You do need to know this equation for photosynthesis in both the word and chemical forms you see here. Okay, so what you have here is 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, plus sunlight or light energy, and glucose, and 6 oxygen. That is the equation for photosynthesis. So these things on the left are going to be your starting reactants. These things on your right are what you end with, so they're going to be your ending products. Make sure you're able to answer what the reactants and products are for photosynthesis. So there's 2 phases, the light reaction or the dark reaction. The dark reaction is also known as the Calvin cycle. Another name is the light independent because it does not need light. Another name for the light reaction is the light dependent. Now, I have a picture of the chloroplast down here. It's an excellent picture. This would be a good thing to learn. Okay, so first off, we have our chloroplast. We have our light going in, our water going in. And this is occurring in the light reaction. And then oxygen goes out, gets released into the atmosphere. Another thing that happens is NADPH and ATP are made, and they go into the dark reaction, the Calvin cycle. Another thing that goes into the dark reaction is the CO2. And then what is released is the glucose, sugar. So this would be a great summarization of what happens. So that brings us to light physics. Because we've talked about photosynthesis, we do need to talk about light a little bit. Light is a part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So, in the electromagnetic spectrum, you have lots of different waves. So, gamma waves are going to be the shortest waves, and radio waves are going to be the longest. Okay? So, wavelength is measured from one peak to the next. And photosynthesis is going to use the visible light spectrum, which is kind of in the middle of that electromagnetic spectrum. Most of the sun's energy that reaches the earth is in that spectrum. So, just for example, violet light has a very short wavelength, but then ultraviolet light, which is the next, it has even shorter wavelength, and it is considered invisible. Then on the other side, red light has a very long wavelength. So infrared light has a even longer wavelength, and it is invisible. So ultraviolet and infrared are invisible because they're not within the visible light range. Okay, so if you take a look here, visible light, you can see is kind of in the middle, and that is how you can see. Then we have all of these on this side of the electromagnetic spectrum can damage your tissues. Okay, so you know UV light can cause skin cancer, that's sunlight. X-rays, gamma rays are both dangerous and can ionize your tissues and cause damage, possibly cancer. So anyway, then you have your visible light, and then here's the infrared I was talking about, and then microwaves and radio waves, which are going to be milder on your tissues. Here's another picture of the electromagnetic spectrum. And notice visible light in all the pretty colors. So when we're talking about light, light is made up of particles called photons. In fact, all those things on the electromagnetic spectrum are made up of photons. So photons are not like atoms or cells. They're different. They're thought to be formed from collisions of atomic nuclei or even electrons. But we do know that photons are little compact bundles of energy. So photon energy is inversely proportional to the wavelength. So what that means is the shorter the wave, like gamma waves, for example, the greater the photon energy. So the ones that have the most photon energy, those are the ones that I mentioned that would harm your tissues. So according to quantum physics, that's like teeny tiny physics, if a photon strikes an atom and is absorbed by that atom, then one of two things either are going to happen. So the electron might be moved to a higher energy level, and so this is what causes fluorescence, or the electron might be lost to the atom and captured by an electron acceptor such as chlorophyll. And so this is what happens in photosynthesis. When the light photon strikes, it is captured by electron acceptors in chlorophyll. So this is just showing atomic nuclei and the photons bouncing all over. And you'll notice how they might bend. That's called scattering. So that brings us to talking about chloroplast. So most of the chloroplast in plants are going to be located in the cytoplasm, because it's an organelle, in a type of plant tissue known as the mesophyll. So if you remember, meso means middle. And of course, phyll is leaf. Okay, so it's literally the middle component of leaves. So anyway, basic anatomy or structure of a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are known to have a double-layered membrane. This is one of the reasons why evolutionary theorists think that chloroplasts once were cells of their own. Anyway, so then you have the stroma. That's inside the inner membrane. It's a fluid-filled region, so it's kind of like the cytoplasm for the chloroplast, so it's a fluid-filled region, and this is where lots of enzymes for photosynthesis are going to be found. Then you have thylakoids. Thylakoids are inside of the stroma, and they contain chlorophyll, and that is where your photosynthesis is going to happen. So if you look at each thylakoid, they are round and flat. They can resemble a coin. Another thing that they could resemble is like a pancake. Anyway, so thylakoids tend to be arranged in stacks or like one on top of the other, like a stack of pancakes or a stack of coins. And that stack is called a granum. And if it's multiple stacks, it would be a grana. That would be the plural. So this is a picture of a chloroplast. So if you notice, you've got an inner and outer membrane. And then you have your stroma, which is kind of the fluid-filled space. Then notice there's one pancake, that's the thylakoid, and then the granum is the stack of thylakoids, the whole stack there. So you can see multiple grana throughout the chloroplast here. And then there is a space between the inner and outer membrane. So this is just another picture of, but a little bit different picture. This picture is actually a cross-section of a leaf. So it's got lots of different tissues in it. So this is not just a cell. This is a picture of many cells. So a couple things I want to point out to you. So here are your cells in this palisade layer. So if you notice, it's in the middle layer. And notice the chloroplast. And that's going to give the leaf the green appearance. Anyway, so you also have the cuticle. If you remember, we learned about that in the biomolecules unit, how the cuticle helps prevent water loss. You have the xylem and phloem. Those were vascular tissues in the plant that help transport food and water. Then you have some air space. And then this is what I wanted to show you is the stomata and guard cells. So the stomata are these little circle things. Let me change colors. They're these circle things. Okay, and they let gases go in and out of the leaf. So this is where gas exchange occurs. It goes into the leaf. Then you have the airspace. Okay, and then you get into the oxygen and carbon dioxide is going to be exchanged with those cells containing the chloroplast. So anyway, the stomata are these circular openings. The guard cells are at the corners or at the edges. And the guard cells literally guard the stomata. And they tell it when to open and close. If it's open all the time, then the plant's just going to lose water as it loses oxygen, carbon dioxide. As carbon dioxide goes in, oxygen goes out. The guard cells are only going to open and close at certain times. So pigments in the plant. So chlorophyll is green. So it mainly is going to absorb light in blue, violet, and red parts of the visible light spectrum that I showed you earlier. So things that are green are not going to absorb green light. So what happens is what the physicists think is that if the object appears to be green, then they are reflecting the light that they do not use. So it's thought that plants are green because they're reflecting the green light that they do not use. So they're going to use the other colors. So you have different types of chlorophyll, but most of the important types are either chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. So chlorophyll A does most of your photosynthesis. Chlorophyll B, it depends on what kind of light is being absorbed. Then you have carotenoids. That has other pigments. So these are going to be your red, orange, and yellow colors. So think of plants that are those colors, like sweet potatoes and carrots and tomatoes. They're going to have carotenoids in them. And so those pigments are also photosynthetic. So carotenoids broaden the spectrum of light available for photosynthesis. And another thing is that you might have carotenoids in something that is green, but you can only see them when the chlorophyll dissipates. So in the fall, you have your deciduous trees or deciduous plants that are going to lose their leaves, right? So what happens is they go from green to another color. Sometimes it goes from green to brown. Sometimes it goes from green to red to yellow to brown. So anyway, all these colors are available because the chlorophyll was kind of taken over with the green. And then once the chlorophyll dissipates in the fall, then you can actually see the other colors. And so that gives us all the beautiful colors of fall. So this is just showing the absorption wavelengths of different plants, or common plants. And notice how the lowest is going to be green. So that's the color they appear. Okay, so photosynthesis. So the light reaction is the first phase. So phase 1, light reaction, also known as light dependent reaction because it depends on light. You got to have light for this to happen. So it makes sense that light starts off photosynthesis because if you remember, photo is light. So what happens first is energy is captured from sunlight. So the pigments in the chloroplast are going to absorb that light energy and they go into the thylakoids. Then that energy is transferred to that light photon. The energy is transferred to the electrons into the chlorophyll. The next stage of the light reaction is going to be when that light is converted into chemical energy. And to do that, water is split. When water is split, that oxygen goes into the atmosphere. So in the light reaction, oxygen is released as a product into the atmosphere. Another product that is made is NADPH. Okay, so the hydrogen that was in the water, so the oxygen goes in the atmosphere. The hydrogen that was in the water combines with NADP to make NADPH. So NADPH is also a product of the light reaction. Okay, NADPH stands for this really long word that I'm probably going to mess up. Yeah, there it is. I'm just not even going to try it, but there it is. Anyway, so NADPH is a coenzyme. So it is basically an electron carrier. So it carries that hydrogen electron. So if you remember when we talked about photons, sometimes the photon can cause the electron to get bumped out, and it can kind of excite the electron. So that's kind of what happened here. So anyway, it carries the hydrogen electron. So it was NADP, now it's NADPH because it's carrying that hydrogen electron. Anyway, so they're going to move down an electron transport system. As it moves down the electron transport system, it's going to produce ATP from ADP and a phosphate group. So there's another product of the light reaction, ATP. So the NADPH is produced from NADP combined with the hydrogen ion that was split off of the water. That is going to be a temporary hold for energy. Okay, so that is going to be used in the next phase, the dark reaction, the Calvin cycle, to turn carbon dioxide into carbohydrates. It's going to give us the H for the carbohydrates. So anyway, to review, light is used. Light and water are both reactants. Let's add that there. So water is a reactant, and sunlight is a reactant. So that's what you start with in the light reaction. And products are going to be oxygen released into the atmosphere, and then NADPH and ATP, which will be used in the second phase. So the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis use the sun's energy to produce what? Well, this is talking about light-dependent, so it depends on light. So this is the light reaction. Okay, so we're using the sun's energy. We didn't produce glucose yet in the light reaction. We used water. We have not used carbon dioxide yet. So we're going to produce chemical energy, and that was ATP. If you remember, we said ATP was a product of the light reaction. Okay, so this is just a picture showing the light reaction producing oxygen gas and the energy ATP and then NADPH to be moved into the second phase we're fixing to talk about, the Calvin cycle. Okay, so if you look here, energy goes in from sunlight, water goes in, okay, and using that energy and water, ADP and NADPH are going to then combine with that hydrogen that was split from the water to make NADPH. Oxygen that was in the water gets spit out into the atmosphere, and then ATP is generated from that energy that was in the sunlight. Now it's in ATP. Now we're going to go into the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the dark reaction. Okay, so that ATP and NADPH, which were products of the light reaction, they are now reactants to the dark reaction. Another reactant is carbon dioxide. Okay, and so what's going to happen is that carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH is going to produce glucose, and that's what we really want. Glucose, if you recall, is C6H12O6. So your carbon and oxygen comes from carbon dioxide, and your H is going to come from NADPH to make your glucose molecule. And then humans can turn around and eat this plant in order to gain carbohydrates, which our bodies can turn into energy. In the light-dependent phase of photosynthesis, energy from the sun is used to drive the production of which of the following molecules? So what is being made in the light-dependent reaction? Okay, hopefully you picked ATP because ATP was a product of the light reaction. The process of photosynthesis produces sugar, water, and, so this is products, if you recall, the light reaction produced oxygen gas. The glucose produced during photosynthesis is an example of a, hopefully you recall from the biomolecules unit, that glucose is a one sugar, a monosaccharide, carbohydrate. When excess sugar is produced in a plant, the plant will it release the sugar into the soil? Well, I don't know about you. I don't go around eating dirt, but dirt is not normally sweet. Will it convert sugar into minerals? Well, to my knowledge, you can't convert carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen into something like zinc. Store the sugar by forming larger molecules? Haven't we talked about that before? Taking a monosaccharide and turning it into a polysaccharide? Yeah, that sounds familiar. So this is definitely the answer. But one last one. Plants do not spontaneously combust. They're not going to just burn themselves. Because most plants are able to undergo photosynthesis, they do not well, hopefully you know that photosynthesis helps plants make their own food. So because of that, they do not depend on other organisms for energy. Photosynthesis begins when sunlight causes chlorophyll molecules to hopefully you recalled when that sunlight photon hits, it causes an electron to be emitted. In photosynthesis, light energy from the sun is stored in the bonds of. So remember, photosynthesis produces carbohydrates. What are the raw materials for photosynthesis? So that's what you start with. Those are your reactants. Okay, so what do you start photosynthesis with? What do plants need? Okay, we know they need sunlight. We know they need water and carbon dioxide. Plants make glucose and oxygen. All right, so that brings us to the second phase of photosynthesis, which is the Calvin cycle. Okay, so this is Calvin cycle. Another name for this is the dark reaction or light independent reaction. So this happens in the stroma, okay, rather than the thylakoids. Okay, so carbon dioxide is going to be a reactant. So that enters the leaf through all those little small pores. Remember the stomata that I showed you. So carbon dioxide enters the leaf through the stomata. And then the carbon dioxide is going to combine with the hydrogen ions from NADPH to form C6H12O6, glucose. Okay, so the carbon comes from carbon dioxide, the oxygen comes from carbon dioxide, and then the H comes from NADPH. Okay, so anyway, we make glucose. Glucose is a monosaccharide. If we make more than we need, then we store them as a complex carbohydrate, a polysaccharide, like starch or cellulose. It just depends on the forgot how to spell that. It just depends on the type of plant. Sorry. So anyway, this is called carbon fixation, turning inorganic carbon to organic carbon. Okay, so that will be CO2 to C6H12O6, which is glucose. Carbon dioxide into glucose. That is carbon fixation, turning inorganic carbon into organic carbon. So anyway, the Calvin cycle is a little simpler than the light reaction. Another thing I wanted to tell you about the Calvin cycle is that Calvin deals with carbon. Okay, so if you see carbon, it goes with Calvin. Okay, and that's pertaining to photosynthesis, not cellular respiration, because the Calvin cycle is not part of cellular respiration. It is only part of photosynthesis. So if you see Calvin, that means the reactant is going to be carbon dioxide, and the product is going to be glucose, C6H12O6. So Calvin, C, C, C. C Calvin goes with C's, your carbons. Now, water, which does not have carbon, Light energy does not have carbon, and oxygen does not have carbon. Those go along with the light reaction. So here's a really cool picture where they've taken a leaf and they've shown the process of photosynthesis. So first off, first phase, your chloroplasts are going to trap the sunlight energy, and notice that's in the middle of the leaf. And then the water is going to enter into the leaf through the veins here. You'll see the veins there. Water enters the leaf through the veins. That's coming from the root. And then third phase, carbon dioxide is going to enter the leaf through the stomata, and then sugar is going to leave the leaf and be stored somewhere in the plant. What are the main products of photosynthesis? So what is produced at the end of photosynthesis? Well, hopefully you know produces glucose and oxygen by now. So glucose will be made in the dark reaction, oxygen would be made in the light reaction. It's very important for you to know reactants and products of both phases of photosynthesis in general, but also of both phases. During photosynthesis, energy from the sun is trapped in, hopefully you recall, in the chemical bonds.